You have never actually experienced tomorrow, not once in your entire life. And yet you have spent more hours living inside it, worrying about it, planning it, rehearsing conversations that haven't happened yet, bracing for outcomes that may never arrive than you have spent actually inhabiting the only moment you have ever had access to. If that sentence made your stomach tighten slightly, keep watching, because it should. Picture the last time you lay awake at 2 a.m, not because anything was happening. Nothing was happening. You were simply lying there, perfectly safe, in a warm bed in a locked house, and yet your mind was somewhere else entirely, running simulations of a meeting 3 days away. Replaying a sentence you might say wrong, calculating a future that hadn't been written yet, as though calculating it hard enough could control it. That's not anxiety in the way we usually talk about anxiety. That's something closer to an addiction. And like every addiction, it doesn't feel like a problem while you're inside it. It feels like responsibility. It feels like foresight. It feels like the mature thing to do. Alan Watts spent much of his life trying to describe this exact mechanism, and near the end of it, he arrived at something almost unbearably simple. The only real problem most human beings have is that they are addicted to the future. Not busy, not unlucky, not undisciplined, addicted in the clinical sense. Dependent on a substance that keeps delivering diminishing returns, unable to stop even when the cost becomes obvious. That word should stop you, because addiction is not a metaphor Watts used lightly. He meant it structurally. He meant that the mind, once it learns to find relief and stimulation in mentally living somewhere other than now, begins to crave that displacement the way a body craves a substance and starts manufacturing reasons to keep going back for more. To understand how strange this is, you have to first notice something most people never stop to examine. The future does not exist anywhere except inside your skull. It has no weather, no texture, no weight. It is a mental construction built entirely out of memory, fear, and guesswork, dressed up to look like information. And yet most people spend the majority of their waking hours living inside that construction as though it were more real than the room they're currently sitting in. This is where psychology becomes uncomfortable, because it means the anxiety you feel about tomorrow isn't really about tomorrow at all. It's about your relationship with uncertainty itself, and that relationship was built long before you ever had a mortgage, a deadline, or a diagnosis to worry about. Neuroscience gives us a precise explanation for why this happens, and it starts with a small, almond-shaped structure buried deep in the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala's job is not to think. Its job is to detect threat instantly before conscious reasoning even has a chance to weigh in. In evolutionary terms, this system kept your ancestors alive. The ones who assumed the rustling in the grass was a predator survived at a higher rate than the ones who calmly waited for confirmation. But the amygdala cannot distinguish between a lion in the grass and an email you haven't answered yet. Both register as threat. Both trigger the same cascade of cortisol and adrenaline, which means a nervous system built to survive physical danger for a few intense seconds at a time is now running almost continuously on imagined future dangers that never resolve, because unlike a lion, an uncertain future never actually arrives to be defeated. It just gets replaced by the next uncertain future. This is where the addiction analogy stops being poetic and starts being literal. Every time you mentally rehearse a future threat, your brain receives a small, familiar hit of vigilance-driven activation, and that activation, paradoxically, feels like doing something. It feels like control. Watch closely, because this is the part almost nobody notices. Worry doesn't feel like suffering while it's happening. It feels like productivity. It feels like the mind working hard on your behalf. And that feeling is precisely what keeps a person returning to it, hour after hour, year after year, long after it has stopped producing anything except exhaustion. Behavioral psychology has a term for the trap this creates: negative reinforcement. It isn't that worry brings pleasure. Most people will tell you honestly that it feels terrible. It's that worry occasionally appears to work. You worry about the flight, and the flight lands safely, and some part of the brain quietly concludes that the worrying helped, even though the plane was never in danger to begin with. That single false correlation, repeated enough times across enough small crises, is all it takes to wire a habit loop as durable as any substance dependency cue. In the form of uncertainty, followed by a behavior, in the form of mental rehearsal, followed by a reward, in the form of relief when the imagined disaster fails to occur. The brain doesn't know the relief had nothing to do with the rehearsal. It only knows the sequence worked, and sequences that work get repeated. But something even more dangerous is happening beneath the surface of this pattern, and it has to do with what you are quietly sacrificing every time you make this trade. Alfred Adler believed that much of human suffering comes from what he called a fictional goal, a projected future point where safety and worth will finally be secured. But Adler's deeper insight, the one people quote less often, was that the fictional goal doesn't just distort the future. It hollows out the present, because the mind treats now as merely instrumental, a means of getting somewhere else, never a place worth occupying in its own right. A person addicted to the future doesn't experience a Tuesday afternoon as a Tuesday afternoon. They experience it as a stepping stone toward Friday, or next quarter, or retirement, or the moment their life will supposedly begin. And a life composed entirely of stepping stones is a life in which nothing is ever actually stood on. Think about the last time you finished something you had anticipated for months, a vacation, a launch, a long-awaited event, and felt strangely empty within days, already scanning for the next thing to look forward to. That emptiness has a name in psychology: the hedonic treadmill. The tendency for satisfaction to fade almost immediately after a goal is reached, pulling you right back into anticipation of the next one. Most people interpret this as a sign that they chose the wrong goal. Watts would have said they misunderstood the entire mechanism. The treadmill isn't broken. It's doing exactly what an addiction does, offering just enough relief to justify one more cycle. Never enough to end the craving. And once you see the treadmill clearly, a far more unsettling question emerges. If satisfaction was never really coming from the destination, what have you actually been chasing all this time? There's a related distortion worth naming here. One cognitive psychologists call the planning fallacy's quieter cousin: the tendency to imagine future versions of ourselves as fundamentally more resolved than we currently are. Ask someone why they're tolerating a job they dislike, a relationship that drains them, or a body they've neglected. And the answer often contains a hidden clause: once things settle, once the timing is right, a more capable version of them will finally handle it. But that future self is a projection, not a person. It has no more discipline, no more courage, and no more clarity than the self doing the imagining right now. The addiction to the future doesn't just steal your present moment. It quietly outsources your hardest problems to someone who doesn't exist yet and never will. Here is where Watts's argument becomes genuinely radical, because he wasn't simply telling people to relax or to stop planning. He understood that planning is necessary. You cannot build a life, raise a family, or run a company without thinking ahead. His warning was narrower and far sharper than that. He was describing the difference between using thought about the future as a tool and living inside thought about the future as a residence. A carpenter picks up a hammer to build something, then puts it down. Most people never put the hammer down. They carry it everywhere, gripping it even while eating dinner, even while lying next to someone they love, even while their own child is trying to get their attention in the present moment, because the mind has quietly confused the tool for a home. This is where most self-help advice fails, because it tells people to simply be present, as though presence were a switch you could flip through willpower. But if the future has become addictive, willpower alone cannot dissolve it. You cannot outdiscipline a dependency you don't understand, which means the real work isn't behavioral, it's diagnostic. You have to understand what the addiction is actually giving you before you can safely take it away. Carl Jung offers one of the clearest answers to that question, though he arrived at it from an entirely different direction. Jung believed that much of the psyche's energy goes toward maintaining a sense of control over an existence that is, at its core, radically uncertain: birth, death, love, loss, none of it guaranteed, none of it fully controllable. He argued that people build elaborate psychological structures specifically to manage the anxiety this uncertainty produces, and that obsessive future orientation is one of the most socially rewarded versions of that structure. Society doesn't call it avoidance. It calls it ambition, foresight, being on top of things, which means the addiction to the future isn't just personally comfortable, it's culturally celebrated, which makes it almost invisible as a pattern, and nearly impossible to question without feeling like you're questioning your own competence. This is where the discomfort deepens, because it means some of the most admired people in any room, the ones who seem the most in control, the most prepared, the most 3 steps ahead, may in fact be some of the most disconnected from their own present experience, not because they are shallow, because they have built an entire identity around outrunning uncertainty, and stopping would mean facing it directly for the first time in years. Viktor Frankl approached this same territory from the most extreme conditions a human being can survive. In the concentration camps, the future was not merely uncertain for most prisoners, it was actively unbearable to imagine. Since imagining liberation and then having it fail to arrive on schedule caused a documented collapse in the will to live among people who had pinned all their psychological survival on a specific future date. Frankl noticed that the prisoners who endured best were not the ones who fixated hardest on a future release. They were the ones who found something to hold on to inside the day they were actually living a memory of someone they loved, a task left unfinished, a value they refused to abandon regardless of circumstance. His conclusion cuts directly against the instinct most of us carry. Fixating on the future doesn't protect you from suffering. In extreme cases, it can accelerate psychological collapse because it makes your entire sense of meaning conditional on an outcome you do not control. That single insight reframes everything Watts was warning about. The addiction to the future promises safety. It delivers the opposite. It manufactures a life in which peace is permanently postponed, contingent on conditions that keep shifting the moment they're within reach. The Stoics diagnosed a version of this same trap 2,000 years earlier, though they used different language. Epictetus built his entire philosophy around a single distinction: some things are within your control and everything else is not. Worry, in his framework, is what happens when the mind refuses to accept that distinction, when it insists on trying to control the uncontrollable by rehearsing it obsessively, as though enough mental effort could force an uncertain future into a guaranteed one. Seneca went further, observing that people who live constantly braced for future misfortune often suffer it many times over once in imagination, repeatedly, and then again briefly, if it actually happens, while people who release that bracing suffer it, at most once. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire under constant threat of war, plague, and betrayal, kept returning to a discipline that sounds almost too simple to be profound. Deal only with what is in front of you right now, and trust that you will be equally capable of dealing with what comes next when it actually arrives, rather than fighting two battles at once, the real one and the imagined one. None of these thinkers were describing a personality flaw. They were describing a structural error in how the mind relates to time, one that appears in every civilization because it isn't cultural. It's built into a threat detection system that was never designed to distinguish between danger you can act on right now and danger that exists only as a mental projection. Evolutionary psychology adds one final, humbling piece to this picture. The ability to simulate the future, to imagine consequences before they happen, is one of the most powerful adaptations the human brain ever developed. It let our ancestors plan a hunt, store food before winter, avoid a territory where predators had been seen. But like most adaptations built for scarcity and physical danger, it was never calibrated for a world of infinite hypothetical futures delivered through a screen you carry in your pocket. A brain designed to simulate a handful of concrete survival-relevant scenarios per week is now asked to process hundreds of abstract, low-probability threats per day: market volatility, distant political instability, a stranger's opinion of you online, and it cannot tell the difference between a simulation worth taking seriously and one that is simply noise. The addiction to the future, in this light, isn't a personal failing at all. It's an ancient gift, badly mismatched to a modern volume of input it was never built to filter. Here is where the deeper layer of Watts's warning surfaces, and it's the layer that gives the addiction metaphor its full weight. Like any addiction, this one comes with withdrawal. The moment you attempt to genuinely inhabit the present, to stop planning, stop rehearsing, stop bracing, many people report something closer to panic than peace. Silence doesn't feel restful. It feels exposed. Because if you're not busy managing the future, you are suddenly face to face with whatever the future focus was, covering grief that never finished processing, a relationship that isn't working, a life that doesn't match the story you've been telling people about it. The addiction to the future isn't just a habit of attention. It's frequently a shelter from a present that feels too uncomfortable to sit inside without distraction. This is why simply telling someone to live in the moment so often fails. For a person whose present contains unresolved pain, the present is not automatically peaceful. Sometimes the future became addictive precisely because the present was unbearable. And the addiction was never really about tomorrow. At all, it was about needing somewhere else to be, which brings the argument to its most uncomfortable turn. If the future addiction is partly a shelter, then removing it prematurely without addressing what it was sheltering you from can feel less like liberation and more like being evicted with nowhere to go. This is why awareness has to come before elimination. You cannot simply stop thinking about the future through force of will any more than you can stop craving a substance through force of will alone. What actually works is noticing, in real time, the specific moment your attention leaves the present and slides into rehearsal and asking, without judgment, what discomfort that slide is helping you avoid, not to fix it in that instant, just to see it clearly enough that it stops running on autopilot. Jung would call this bringing the pattern into consciousness. Frankl would call it locating meaning inside the moment you're actually in rather than the moment you're hoping for. The Stoics would call it separating what belongs to you from what doesn't. Watts, characteristically, put it more simply than any of them, you cannot actually live anywhere except now, no matter how convincingly your mind insists otherwise. And every minute spent rehearsing a future that has not happened yet is a minute permanently withdrawn from the only account you were ever given access to. He wasn't saying this as comfort. He was saying it as a warning. Because most people don't discover the size of that withdrawal until very late, until a diagnosis, a death, or a sudden reversal forces the mind out of the future and violently back into the present, and they look around at the life that was actually happening the whole time, mostly unattended. There is a strange relief hidden inside this warning, even though it doesn't announce itself as relief at first. If the future you've been bracing for is largely a construction built from memory, fear, and guesswork, rather than fact, then much of what you've been carrying was never actually yours to carry in the first place. You don't have to solve tomorrow today. Tomorrow, when it arrives, will simply be another today, met by a version of you who will have exactly the resources that moment requires, because that has been true every single day of your life so far, whether you noticed it or not. So here is the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. If you added up every hour you have spent this year rehearsing a future that either never arrived or arrived nothing like you imagined, and compared it to the hours you spent actually inside the one moment you were guaranteed, which one has really been running your life? If this kind of psychology, the kind that changes how you actually relate to your own mind, not just how you think about it, is something you want more of, consider subscribing, only if it genuinely resonated with you. There's more waiting beneath the surface.